Bon après-midi, nous, nouveau panel. Nous avons une délégation sortie du ministère Transport, spécifiquement ministère Civil Aviation, Ports and Marine. Et avec nous, nous avons M. Alain Renaud, son secrétaire principal, et aussi Mme Magali Essac, directeur policier. Bienvenue et merci pour joindre nous pour cet après-midi. Je m'invite le panel pour faire aucun statement ou bien présentation qui sont contents de démarrer avec. Monsieur Renaud, on va commencer.
Mr. Speaker, Leader of the Government Business, Leader of the Opposition, honorable members, members of the public watching us today, thank you. My colleague and I are today representing the Ministry of Transport, and we are the parent ministry of Air Seychelles, and we're here to talk about our plans for Air Seychelles and our support for our national airline, the wonder that is Air Seychelles. As Mr. Speaker mentioned, we will begin first with my colleague, the Director of Policy and Strategy, who will have an opening statement, following which I will do a presentation talking about the 2021...
Monsieur Renaud,
Yes?
sorry, I'm not hearing you well. Can you speak closer to the micro?
Yes.
And straight into it? Because of the mask, you have to make a little bit more of a voice
May I?
effort.
Okay. Is this better? I could, but I think your public may be more confused if I do it in Creole versus saying it in English. Unfortunately, I'm one of those people that find it difficult to learn languages, and I left Seychelles when I was 3 years old. I've always loved my country, and my parents taught us to speak English at home because they were afraid we wouldn't learn English, so they spoke English. But I've always had an affinity and love for Seychelles, which is why I'm back and contributing to our country, and I do apologize for being one of those individuals.
Please proceed.
Okay, and so we'll start with a statement from my colleague Magali in Creole on the position of our ministry.
Thank you. Madame Isaac.
Mr. Speaker, Leader of Government Business, Leader of the Opposition, membre honorable et public à l'écoute. Bon après-midi. Paris, puis Yassine Ferry sorti, nous représentons le ministère des Transports et statement qui nous envie de dire aujourd'hui, c'est que Air Seychelles, pour l'année 2021, en bas nos ministères, nous reconnaissons pour dire qu'il y a un rôle important pour les jouer. Air Seychelles, il y a l'accompagnement gouvernement, il y a plus stake là-dedans, et il y a l'accompagnement qui rapporte directement avec nos ministères des Transports et tombe en bas nos départements. Air Seychelles, il y a un mandat qui nous donne Air Seychelles pour l'année 2021, c'est que Air Seychelles lui-même, il besoin démontrer avec le gouvernement et spécialement avec le ministère comme quoi il est capable de faire un business profitable et aucune décision qui peut prendre, qui peut arriver à Air Seychelles, il peut rester une décision qui nous ministre pour prendre, ministre pour transport, ministre Anthony Derjacques, et ça, il peut prendre par un cabinet décision qui promène devant mon cabinet pour mettre nous analyse qui nous peut faire interne. Et pareil, nous faire ressortir, il y a ça plan business, un business plan qui nous peut demander ces choses pour venir, pour présenter avec le ministère, pour nous capables d'approuver et donner une directive le côté il peut aller. Sa modèle, pareil, m'en expliqué auparavant, il besoin montrer pour dire que l'opération qui est viable et l'opération qui est soutenable pour lui-même as a business. Il est vrai que l'aviation, pendant ça l'état qui nous était, il n'est pas vraiment certain. It is very uncertain. Situation Covid, il pas aide lui-même comme l'année aérienne. Mais par contre, bon programme de vaccination qui peut mettre en place par bon pays et aussi par Cécile, nous pouvons présumer pour dire que SHL, si pour capable, tape de bon market, pareil, tu peux faire de les passer surtout avec Israël, qui fait vraiment bien de mois de décembre. Pareil, le ministère des Finances, il vient devant nous, il vient justifier. SHL, il a un budget 133 millions de roupies qu'il a mis, et ça, il veut dire que salaire, bon staff, SHL, pour ça l'année, il assuré pour ça l'année 2021, provided les autres approuvent sa budget. Ça veut dire, le côté ministère, nous ne pouvons pas prévoir pour dire que pour aucun staff qui peut perdre l'emploi directement. Mais par contre, par exemple, faire ressortir, c'est performance salariale qui, pour en sa décision, quoi qui peut arriver. Et par exemple, il y a beaucoup de causes, il y a une négociation avec les bondholders, les shareholders. Et ça, il y a une négociation qui est encore ongoing. Il y a l'équipe technique qui involve, qui inclut le ministère des Finances, nous ministères nous-mêmes, attorney général, quand ça a une discussion, il y a encore peut dérouler. Mon vie faire ressortir encore pour dire que le côté ministère, nous pas encore approuvé aucun plan business SHS, aucun plan qui se peut penser à approuver. Nous pas encore donné final approbation. Il y a quelque chose qui vient devant nous et ministère, le côté ministère, il précise ensemble avec un technicien et nos ministres pour lead ça. Et pendant l'année, après l'État nous réouvert full après le 15 mars, nous pouvons expecter qu'il y a ces choses pour viable, pour démontrer son capacité comment l'année à rien. Mais également, on veut faire ressortir pour dire le côté ministère, aucune décision finale pour qu'on prend, et ça est pour qu'on prend par nos ministres qui pour mener ça devant le cabinet pour une final decision. Merci.
Merci. À ce point, M. Renaud, vous voulez répondre à la présentation, bien quoi?
Oui. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What I will do next is I will talk about how we see aviation growing in 2021 and where SHL fits within that framework along with the other airlines. Here is my opening statement, and I will take you through the logic and the reasoning, and this will provide the members some assurance about where SHL's business plan is expected to fall. Next.
Thank you.
The first thing we need to understand is we are in the middle of a pandemic. COVID-19 is not the worst pandemic the world has ever seen. Not shown here is the bubonic plague where 200 million people died in the Spanish flu. However, next, we have never in the entire history of aviation had a crisis like this. This graph starts at 1945. Aviation has grown and gone through many, many crises over the years. We've had oil crises, Gulf crises, Asian crises, SARS, 9/11, but none have ever left aviation the way it's done. Minus 60% decline in world total passengers in 2020. Next. Neither has our civil aviation ever seen anything like this. What you are seeing on this screen, the red line is the number of flights operated by SHLs. The blue line is the number of flights operated by Emirates, and the gray line shows the cumulative total of all flights by other airlines. At the far right is when we shut down the airport in 2020. If I take the graph all the way back to the beginning of aviation in Seychelles, you'd have the same story as globally. So this crisis we are seeing with Seychelles and civil aviation is unprecedented in our history. You'll see a little bump at the end, and I will talk about that later. Next. This is like Thanos snapping, and all we can do is start over. Next. When you start over, we are starting from scratch. First principles. Whatever happened in the past doesn't mean it's going to be what happens next, and we're going to have to fight because we're fighting against a pandemic and we're fighting against all manner of challenges. But what we will do is whatever it takes. Near-term outlook. I'm going to describe for you 4 paths. This is ICAO. ICAO publishes data for all member states. It talks about pairs, traffic pairs between different regions, and talks about their projected economic development. And they have some of the world's best economists and airlines involved IATA to come forward. And what they tell all member governments to do is to look at 4 paths forward. And they provide the data, and we're going to show you how we apply it for the Seychelles case to give you an idea of what we think is going to happen in 2021. Next. The 4 shapes are, we have a V-shaped recovery, where things pop back up very quickly the way they are. We know this is not going to happen. We've missed that. A U-shaped recovery is we stay down for a long time and then suddenly grow very quick near the end. An L-shaped is the worst thing we can think of in that we have a protracted long-term downturn. It's an L down and we stay down, which means we will suffer for many, many months. And then we have a W, which is a double dip recession, where we go up, come down, go up, come down. Right now, we're sort of in the middle of a W. And then there's a Nike swoosh, which was mentioned by some economists. But those are the 4 shapes that we are going to model for our tourism industry. It depends on a lot of different factors. None of it is under control. What happens in England? What happens in France? If there are mutant COVID viruses, all are things that are outside of our control. But next, there are things that are in our control. Here, we have different versions of it, and a lot of it will depend on us as an island and our response, how we control the virus and how we are ready for it. I am very happy with the March, with the vaccination program, and this will provide us a very firm base for us to grow from March onwards. So hopefully this will help us get into a V-shaped recovery, but I will show you the 4 different ranges, and this will show you where we're going to be. And this is very important because our 2021 budget assumes that we will have 115,000 passengers, tourists, this year. I will show you that that is a very reasonable estimate. Next. If we look at previous pandemics, it has been very V-shaped. In the earlier graph that I showed you, over nearly 80 years of aviation, we've never had anything like COVID. What that means is aviation is remarkably resilient. I can tell you that for a fact. With our neutral advisory system, I could see the people who are applying, and even though we're in the middle of a pandemic, people still want to travel. So the history of aviation has shown that people will still want to travel. There's no indication that travel will end. It's just that there are complications for that. How long will it take us to recover? 6 months was the worst we've seen before. Obviously, ours is going to be much longer. Here is why we have very good reasons to hope. Next, thank you. Stay there. This is why we are very hopeful about what will happen in 2021. What I've done here in this graph is I've zoomed in on that little bump at the end of the first chart that I showed you. What you are seeing before you are the number of tourists that have come to our country by week since September 15, when we started tracking the data. In the weeks of October and November and December, we saw Edelweiss come, we saw British Airways come, and we saw, of course, the Israel market opened up. And Israel was an interesting case because it was a Category 1, it was right next door, and we had direct flights by Air Seychelles, which I'll talk about later, plus other airlines. So the demand is there. What we found out is a lot of people did not want to come because of the complexity of our rules, and I'll emphasize this a bit more. At the moment, as you can see, in week 4 of 2021, we are at a very low level. We have not closed our airport, but in effect, it is closed because people are not coming. Mostly because there's a raging pandemic in their own homes, in their own countries, and also we have our own, where we're being very strict with a quarantine on arrival. Such policies will prevent tourism from arriving. These are the things under our control. Next. Let us show you now how we will calculate the number of tourists we will see this year, and in these calculations, I will show you where Air Seychelles will hunt. Next. We cannot use what airlines have scheduled. What happens is, in 2020, half of planned flights were canceled. So you'll have Emirates putting 7 flights a week, but when it gets closer to the day, they're canceling. So we cannot say, oh, things are looking rosy because Turkish Airlines has put so many flights and Air France has put so many flights. No. What we have to do is do the basics, which is go back to the markets, which is the ICAO data that I showed you at the very beginning that we're going to do. Let's frame it. For the entire world, Europe and Asia Pacific accounts for over 70% of international traffic. Thank you. Europe alone accounts for 890 million international passengers in 2019 per year, Asia Pacific 517. Not all of that is coming to Seychelles. It's going all over the world. North America's next, Middle East, Latin America, Caribbean, and Africa, down below at 79 million. What does it look like for Seychelles? In 2019, next, what did Seychelles have? In Seychelles, Europe traditionally has accounted for Europe, not just Europe, North America, Oceania, such as Australia, such as South America, and Asia. All of these markets have accounted for almost 73.6% of our international traffic. As you can see by the very strong first line, Europe has been our dominant market. In the previous graph, I showed you Europe is one of the biggest. Regional network, those within, as I'll show you, Seychelles reach, is only 26.4% of that market. However, that's what it was like before the snap. And past performance is not indicative of future results. Next, let us look at what has happened since September 2020. Who has actually come to Seychelles? Has it followed our traditional pattern? No. The orange lines are, in fact, regional markets, markets that are reachable by Air Seychelles. Our number one market since Q3 2020 has been the Middle East. And of course, the majority of this is Israel, which I'm including in the Middle East category. Next has been Europe, our traditional market. It's still there, though now Israel is number one. This is the kind of things that happen after a snap. Africa is number three, no longer at the bottom of the list. And then we have the Indian subcontinent, of course, Asia, Indian Ocean, and so forth. One point I want to make about the Middle East is available to Air Seychelles, but they also have a lot of competition in the Middle East because we have Qatar and we have Emirates and other airlines, Etihad and Turkish. So next, one of the brilliant things is that those countries that have a lot of intra-region traffic, when I say intra, I'm talking within their region, that is a sign that they will grow very fast. We've seen domestic flights grow very quickly, and so we see two of our markets, Europe and Asia, have very strong domestic markets, which means their local economies are still fairly strong, which means those countries still have a lot of disposable income. Next, that's a good sign. Here are, and you don't need to get into the details, but here's how I did it. So here we have 4 of those markets, the expected 4 scenarios. In the top left, Asia Pacific, in the top right, Europe, in the top right, bottom left, Middle East, and in the bottom right, Africa. International. Go back, please. What ICAO has done with IATA and all the rest is made predictions, best case, worst case, about the amount of international travel from any of these destinations. There's no need for us to get down into the details because it's very high level. In this case, Asia Pacific will be down 60 to 80%. In the first half of the year, Europe 40 to 75%, Middle East 55 to 75, Africa 35 to 60. Next. And then we have smaller markets at Seychelles. We have North America and Latin America, which contributed traditionally very small, 45 to 70 down, 35 to 55. Now, this is only showing what's going to happen in the next 6 months. We're only going to open up our airport at vaccination, where we open up the whole world, in March. We have already lost some months. And it's going to take some time for vaccination certificates to become standardized. It's going to be complicated because you'll have PCR plus vaccination. All of those together, we have decided, as a conservative estimate, is even though these percentages are for the next 6 months, we're going to say that they apply for the entire year. If I'm wrong, it means we'll go faster. So this is the worst case, most pessimistic scenario that I'm going to show you. Next. I won't have to show you all the calculations, but we've done it. And for the interested reader at home, you can follow my calculations by going to NBS and doing all the calculations yourself. But based on our analysis and following the formulas produced by ICAO for the member states, our prediction for Seychelles in 2021, in worst case, we will see 95,000 tourists this year. And if we are very lucky and things turn around very quickly with vaccination certificates, we may see as high as 207,000 tourists by the end of the year. Shirin and her team thought it was 189,000. I told the minister I think it's going to be between 75 and 150, and all of our calculations, now that we've done it properly, have come correctly. We did the same calculation in May of 2020, and we were spot on by what was going to happen in 2020. Whether this works this year, I don't know, but I'm very confident in these results. Now, this wide range of 95,000 to 207,000 means a lot of it is dependent on us. What ways are we going to have policies? Are we going to have simplified rules by which we allow people to stay? Are we going to have Category 1, Category 2 hotels, 10 days, 5 days, all those? All of that complexity is what is going to dampen demand, and it's for us to think about. Next. Go back one. I think we skipped, can you go back? Okay, okay, so go next one. Yes. Now, we talk about Air Seychelles. That green circle there is Air Seychelles hunting grounds. It is, roughly speaking, the range of an A320neo. As you can see, what Air Seychelles can hunt represents 26.4% of all of the potential in 2019. Outside of that sphere is 73.6% of where traditional tourists used to come from. This one is going to come from the likes of Emirates and Etihad and Turkish and all the rest. I will tell you this, Emirates in 2020 only stopped flying for 2 weeks and has been flying continuously since then. With the numbers that I showed you on the previous screen, I am very confident the other airlines will come in. But what's interesting is, as I showed you, in Q3 of 2020, we had a different mix. Israel was at the top. We had a lot of Africa, and we had a lot of regional traffic, which means that Air Seychelles' hunting ground in the first half of this year is going to be very fertile. Even though it represents 26.4% of the potential, there's opportunities for Air Seychelles in theory. The only problem with this graph is a large part of the 26.4% is the Middle East, and there's a lot of competition. So Air Seychelles will have to fight for market share with El Al and Arkia in Israel. If they decide to go to Dubai, they'll have to fight with Emirates, and if they have to go to Abu Dhabi, they'll be fighting with Etihad. As an example, when Air Seychelles was going to Tel Aviv last year, they had the whole market until El Al and Arkia entered the chat, and the market share went from down to 30% of the total number of tourists. But there's still an opportunity for Air Seychelles. Next. Based on that analysis and going country by country, we are able to establish tourism targets, which we will share with tourism industry and with Air Seychelles. Based on our numbers, Europe market, we will see between 67,500 and 159,000 tourists this year from Europe and beyond. And the total market size at Air Seychelles, we think, can bite, can eat, ranges from 27,600 to 48,400. And so it is in there that Air Seychelles will be producing for us a business strategy on which destinations, how frequently they're going to move, and what they're going to do to get those tourists to come here. The opportunity is there, and we, as Magali has said, have providing the full support of our Ministry of Transport for that plan. But I hope you can see the total context. And when, as travel begins to blossom again, so we have to think about Air Seychelles' business model. As the Europe and beyond markets start to grow, this increases Air Seychelles' ground handling revenue, because that revenue is dependent on the others. So the more that other airlines fly, the stronger Air Seychelles becomes. As well, the more other airlines come, contributing more tourists, we will have more flights to Kuala and on our domestic route. And depending on how that develops, again, Air Seychelles will strengthen based on how the other airlines are doing. So Air Seychelles' future is dependent on the whole destination succeeding. But alone, on its own, Air Seychelles has a place for it to find its place. And this is the challenge that we have put to our management and to the team there. And I think they've talked in great detail about that. And we won't get into that, the details of their business plan. But we already know when we'll know if they're succeeding or if they're failing or exceeding their targets. Now, I want to tell you again about one of the key success factors for us to be closer to the 207,000 value versus the 95,000 value. COVID has been a terrible, terrible disease. And now we have new mutant strains running around the world in Brazil, in England, in South Africa, and almost certainly we'll see more terrible things happen with this virus, and let's hope that the vaccines that we have will be strong. What has been very difficult for us to start the engine again for our tourism industry has been the policies that we've had. And we thank the doctors very much. In fact, we're all safe here today because of that. But it's something for us to bear in mind that once we pass March and we have the vaccination policies, we need to think very carefully if we're running out of money, how we simplify that message, whether we can organize ourselves to make it simple for people that travel at Seychelles, and that the rules are easy for travel agents to sell because the demand is there. And I thank you very much.
Merci, M. Renaud. Madame Isaac, ou on n'a aucune continuation, quelque chose pour ajouter à ces points?
Non, on n'a pas.
OK, merci. Mr. Renaud, are you comfortable with questions in Creole?
Yes.
OK, thank you. Bon, ben, on invite bon membre pour interacter. Oui, honorable Pilet.
Merci, Mr. Speaker. Merci, M. Renaud, avec Ms. Magali pour la présentation. Moi, je suis content de demander basé sur le fait que nous avons quantité d'informations depuis le matin et sorti côté staff Seychelles, management Seychelles, ministère des Finances et les autres membres du département de transport. So, moi, je suis content de demander une question basée sur ce qui est Seychelles, si nous présente avec nous. Et moi, assurer qu'ils ont aussi aware qui plan Seychelles si en a. Est-ce que comment ministère ou bien département gouvernement qui supposé en oversight le Seychelles, les autres confidents qui s'appellent qui Seychelles nous présenté et basé sur l'information qui M. Renaud met devant nous l'Assemblée qui est Seychelles pour capable avec sa modèle business en particulier et pour capable overcome certaines difficultés qui en a devant lui. Et qui l'engagement qui département ou bien les autres départements ou bien ministère peut faire pour assurer que sa component ground handling qui est un component important de sa modèle business à Seychelles, il n'est pas un component qui gagne d'allude d'aucune façon. Nous connaissons déjà il y en a un sous un raccord ou bien phobie avec un compagnie qui peut opérer ground handling. Est-ce que nous pas devrions prendre décision pareille les autres endroits à faire pour qu'ils nous donnent les faits que nous en avons la compagnie aérienne nationale et qui nous en a quantité de ces lois qui dépendent de sa compagnie et pays éventuellement pour besoin dépend le revenu qui ça bandi money generate pour faire qu'en exclusivité nous pas mettre sa component business à Seychelles dans aucun risque. Merci Mr. Speaker.
Merci, honorable. Oui, panel, lequel... Yes, Mr. Renaud.
Thank you, Honorable Pile. In the first instance, I take you back to the first slide about, or slide number 4, where what we're experiencing now is something unprecedented for entire aviation. Now, when we have 400,000 tourists a year, and we have lots of tax revenue from all the activities going on, government has money to support Air Seychelles. Half that money comes from fishing, half comes from tourism. When we've been snapped and there's no revenue and there's no tourism, the very animal that's going to be able to support Air Seychelles is what we don't have. So this is the first challenge we have, in that we, of course, want to support Air Seychelles, but we're struggling with that. And I think this is what Damien and Patrick is the challenge. Nobody wants to let Air Seychelles go. That said, if we go back to where we were at 2019 levels, and we look at where Air Seychelles' business plan is, it's true. In their blended business model, and if you take away all the interest that they have, they would have something that loses money for a while, and eventually we get to a profitable sort of state. Profitable in the sense of you add everything together. So in that sense, they came up with something. But whether that model is something that's delivering tourists or something else is a totally different question. So that's that. To your other question about the, so the challenge now is what can they do for us this year? And so the business plan that we're waiting for and that we'll be reviewing, as Patrick and Damien mentioned earlier, is something that we're working on over the next 2 weeks to see that, at least for this year, the money that we're putting in, because we're not so sure about what will happen overseas, beyond that 6-hour range, that Air Seychelles nevertheless can contribute greatly to our economy in that meantime, even though we're losing money. With respect to ground handling, that is definitely 100% something that will always be, the airport is a strategic national asset. Normally in very big airports, you would have competition. So if you go to Heathrow, if you go to Paris Charles de Gaulle, you'll see Swissport, you'll see a whole bunch of different companies that do ground handling. But this has to be tempered by the size of your airport and also the difficulty of the aviation to do that. In the case of Seychelles, I think the case is very clear. You want to have a single ground handler. I just want you to imagine 2 sets of equipment out on that little ramp, 2 sets of guys trying to move cargo trucks both ways. SCA now having to audit 2 companies. Now you have 2 sets of things. All of that complexity is going to create something that perhaps is more unsafe than when you have a single one with a very good service level agreement. So no, on our side, exclusivity on ground handling is something that we will absolutely do, and we will protect that. And the wealth that's generated through that ground handling is something that we will not relent. I don't know if you want to add anything.
Merci. Fini?
Yeah, and just so you know, we met with Air Seychelles yesterday, and we gave them the parameters. We are the parent ministry of Air Seychelles, but that doesn't mean that we can't hold them accountable and be tough with them. So we want them to work. We know they work very hard, but now we need them more than ever, our mighty avengers of the air, to help us and save us for this year. And so that's what we're hoping to see from them in the next 2 weeks.
Merci, Renaud. Oui, Honorable, can I follow up?
Yeah, merci, Mr. Speaker. A very, very quick follow-up. Est-ce que nous avons une garantie avec M. Renaud qui sa bonne meeting qui nous entendait en relation avec sa groupe sorti à Abu Dhabi vis-à-vis airport? Il n'a pas rien pour faire avec ground handling ou bien aucun component sa business à cause d'un modèle business qui nous avons présenté avec bon matin qui est Seychelles une cause là. Sa component il feature prominently et il est important pour sa recovery plan qui peut préparer, qui nous avons préparé pour Seychelles. Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci, Honorable. Oui, Madame Isaac.
Lorsqu'à côté sa bonne délégation qui sortit à Abu Dhabi concernant l'airport, par le ministre fait sortir de son interview avec les médias, sa causerie qui en a, il basically prend pour faire avec redéveloppement airport. Pareil, nous tous nous connaissons une nouvelle administration qui là, il y a un bon plan pour redévelopper stricti actuel qui en a pour airport. Par exemple, qu'on est domestique, ça composant qui get un peu plus international qui nous actuel international airport qui était là. So, sa discussion, c'est une discussion pour essayer de comprendre qui quantité d'investissement vous pour besoin pour développer cette infrastructure. Et il n'a pas rien pour faire avec l'opération Air Seychelles et n'a pas rien pour faire avec ground handling Air Seychelles. Et c'est pour moi tout ça c'est sa plan qui Air Seychelles il présenté quelquefois ma va mettre attention le côté ministère. We are yet to discuss and approve this plan. Il n'y a pas encore un plan qui nous finit de discuter en son totalité. Et il y a une bonne équipe technique qui peut assister avec Air Seychelles, avec son management, pour discuter là. Par exemple, c'est une faire ressortir et nous pouvons faire ressortir encore pour dire que Air Seychelles, c'est une entité gouvernement. Air Seychelles, son ministère, c'est le ministère Transport, et c'était en bas ministère Transport et en bas direction ministère Transport, ministère Jacques, qui peut donner the final approval of any plan qui peut gagner zéro par à la compagnie. Merci.
Merci, Madame Isaac. Honorable Henri.
Merci, Mr. Chair. Bon après-midi. Le fait que le ministère Transport et parent company Air Seychelles, parent ministry Air Seychelles, sommes envie demande des questions autour business model. À cause nous vivons voir qui m'a ça la compagnie pour grandir, 6 ans mais envie sortir dans cette situation côté était. Premièrement, l'étant PS dans slide on montre the hunting ground of SHLs qui ont décrit comme fertile. Moi envie qu'on component l'Afrique, un continent avec 1,2 billion de monde qui aujourd'hui ben africain est capable de voyager dans seulement 22% continent sans un visa et c'est seul aujourd'hui il est seul pays africain. Je répète, le seul pays africain qui tout africain est capable de venir sans besoin un visa, ni on arrival ni apply avant ou entrer. Ou par c'est nous retourner chez vous pour vacances. Présent qui m'a nous ka servi ça et Seychelles tap into ça m'a assez. Est-ce qu'il y a une discussion qui est dans la table aujourd'hui à cause nous connaissons beaucoup de vol commercial entre bonnes régions, il presque non existant et s'il existait, il sert. Donc qui m'a nous ka tap into sa potential market. Mon première question. Deuxième question de business model, nous connaissons pour dire à part Air Seychelles qui en vol pralin, domestically, il y en a l'autre la compagnie IDC. Qui m'a gouvernement aujourd'hui qui a mis Air Seychelles et IDC assis autour de la table et dit que ça, un petit pays, tous les deux entités gouvernement merge autres assets pour qui Air Seychelles take over everything domestique. Il y a même des touristes aussi loin, nous ban îles éloignées pour visiter, faire des trips, whatever modèle qui est capable et tourisme. So ça y a des questions autour tap into Africa as a potential tourism market et deuxième IDC and Air Seychelles merging their operation. Merci.
Merci, honorable. Okay. Yes, Mr.
Thank you,
Reno.
Honorable Member. So with respect to Africa, definitely there is potential. In 2016, I was a speaker at IATA Day in Abuja, Nigeria. And the one thing it was the first place I ever did an Uber was in Abuja, Nigeria. Not something I would have expected, but they were really advanced. And their speed of business and things and their disposable income, and they knew Seychelles as a holiday destination. They've gone to Europe, they've gone to other places, and for them, Seychelles was a jewel within Africa. So that, as they said, it's incredible that we have all these Europeans who have such a vision about Seychelles. Why can't Africans know that this is also part of their own continent and want to come and experience the same as everyone else? And yes, definitely this is there. The challenge you have with Africa, there's a twofold problem there. Problem number one is Africa itself, their bilaterals tend to be very closed, which makes it very difficult. Luckily for us, we've been pushing very, very hard to open up. The more we do that, the better. This is why we have Ethiopian here, which is why we have Kenya Airways, and why we're able to do it to Tanzania. So we have a lot of the eastern seaboard. If we look at our Nigerian bilateral, it's a bit closed, a bit difficult to do. And so we need to do a little bit more work for there, but this is something for sure needs to be in a long-range plan for Air Seychelles on how to develop that. So that's that. The second problem that you have is it's always difficult to develop a new market in aviation. So typically airlines are a bit lazy. You look for an origin destination market that already exists. For example, way back when, Air Seychelles knew that there was a lot of Mauritians in London. And so when we used to go to London, we took Mauritians and took them to Mauritius because we knew that was there. I mean, come on, we didn't have to find it, we just know. So when you go to Africa, if there's parts of Africa that don't know about Seychelles, this is where we need STB and others to help do that. So it'll take time, but it has to be in the plan. In fact, as Magali said, I think we would reject any strategy that did not have that in there as a component. On your second point, having to do with the outer islands, we will soon, in this quarter, be releasing a new national aviation policy. As Minister has said several times in his public statements, we want to liberalize. Now, on the one hand, we could just sit there and say, let's combine Air Seychelles with IDC and see how that goes. And that's definitely a thing that we'll do. What I can tell you is domestic markets are always more profitable than international for any airline, and particularly here I remember once some guy shaking me down in South Africa and say, when can Seychelles fly the day wash? I want to go to my villa. It's too much. And he wanted competition on that route. And so these are the kind of things where I think Seychelles, if it's allowed to compete on those islands at the very minimum, and is allowed to do fairly, we can do that. But we have to look at IDC and its model because it might be critical to its business model. And as you said correctly, we have to look at it in its totality. The second issue with the outer islands is something my colleague Glenn Burridge told me about. The thing about the outer islands is it'll be small volumes, necessarily so. What makes the beauty of our archipelago is this thing. So what we want is something modest, high quality, and attracts the very best tourists. Will Seychelles make money in that? Oh, definitely. Will tourism industry and the fact that people can go there help our whole island? Yes, definitely. So yes, I think we should do that and look at ways. And the way we'll do it, as Maggie said, is we're looking to liberalize our domestic space. And what that means is Seychelles, along with others, will be able to compete freely on these islands and have new entrepreneurs come in. I think this will be something that will be wonderful. Seychelles should not fear it.
Thank you. Honorable Cosgrove.
Merci, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, bon matin, avec différentes discussions que nous gagnons dans l'Assemblée et aussi bonnes discussions que nous gagnons avec Seychelles en général auparavant. L'argument est plus ou moins émotionnel et aussi financier. Moi, je suis content de mon PS, la opposition, comme ministère, comme PS pour l'aviation. D'autres perspectives, il y a une qui policie. Nous entendons bon matin à travers Seychelles comme quoi qui est foreign airlines qui practice predatory practices. Je suis content de mon PS qui continue de préparer, how prepared été son département, gouvernement pour mettre en place une policy pour protéger le national airline against some predatory practices. Et est-ce qu'il PS au fil qui s'il y a une possibilité que Seychelles y ferme, ou at least international ou regional route y ferme, est-ce que quoi nous pouvons give up a bargaining chip qui nous en a, and ultimately putting the stability of nos sovereignty at risk? Je suis content de l'opinion PS, ça a dit quelque chose. Merci.
Merci, honorable. PS, please.
Thank you, Honorable Cosgrove, for those outstanding questions. In 2012, I remember when we first, it's important to put some history here. We were traditionally a very protected airspace. In 2012, when Etihad came, we had only 8 active bilaterals. Those are the traditional markets that you know about: Italy, Singapore, South Africa, and a few places. When Etihad came and started its partnership, the first thing they wanted to do was we wanted to feed code shares over a route and create a kind of hub in the Indian Ocean. So they demanded that we sign a lot of new bilaterals. And I distinctly remember, and I apologize if he's listening to me now, we were sitting together, myself and Mr. Gilbert Four, and we were looking at each other and says, once we go down this path, we can't put the toothpaste back in the toothpaste tube. Because once you open up, it's a one-way thing. You can keep it closed, but when you open, the word bilateral is exactly what it means. You open it up, and it works both ways. And it makes sense. I allow you to come into my house, you better let me come, you better let me go to your house. It's just the way it is. So when we went down that path, we went down an inexorable path. At the same time, we felt, okay, now we're going to allow more competition. What IATA and ICAO tell you is when you open up your skies, you're going to see growth. It is sometimes challenging for your home airline, but the big thing is, what does it do for your country? What did we see after 2012? Seychelles saw a double-digit tourism growth. I didn't have the statistics going all the way back, but you'll see that we suddenly started to see a big acceleration once we started opening up. I remember signing the bilateral with Switzerland in 2014. Edelweiss came in 2018. It's like you're pregnant with possibility when you sign these bilaterals. So as Seychelles now, you can't go back. It's almost an act of war to sort of say, hey, I gave you 14, now let's go back to 2. It doesn't work that way. So as Seychelles, yeah, it will have to compete. But at the same time, it's done amazing things for our economy. We've grown. And so what it means is that Seychelles has to find a new role, a new niche. Now, you ask the question, does that challenge our sovereignty? I would say no, not now, and I'll tell you why. All of us have heard the word national insurance policy, and we've just accepted that, but have we ever asked ourselves what it means? What does that mean? National insurance policy. Air Seychelles will fly when nobody else will. Now, try and think of a situation where Air Seychelles can fly somewhere where nobody else would want to fly. It's a very, yes, and that means no one can fly. Right now, in January, Emirates is flying, Qatar is flying, Ethiopian is flying, but Air Seychelles is not. What happened is a situation where one guy doesn't want to go, but the other guy can go, is usually something geopolitical or something under our control. As we said before, currency exchanges, we hold on to your money, something else like that. But anything that would affect the Seychelles will affect the other guys. Today, we have, or in 2019, we had 14 airlines operating 75 flights a week. They're invested in the route and the way their model works. And so it's actually a different situation. They can take their money out. We've liberalized our banking system. So what I would say is the danger is not so much today, and the proof was in the pudding. If you look at the graph in the handout that I showed you, you'll see that Emirates only stopped flying for 2 weeks, whereas Air Seychelles was a little bit longer doing repatriation flights. So I think we have a more resilient industry, but it does mean what Air Seychelles can do is now smaller. They'll never go back long haul probably to Europe unless some new technology comes along. Was there another question?
Thank you. Honorable George.
Merci, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, il y a quelque chose de fatigant depuis tout à l'heure, et moi, je suis content, panel, aide-moi. Et une bonne quelque chose qui M. Tiranti dit, nous, il est encore avec moi, et ça c'est, the board has got to be responsible. Et ils ont besoin, on top of things. Si Air Seychelles, pour moi, il faudrait qu'ils soient board up to the mark. Et nous voyons ce qui est arrivé pendant sa bonne des 3 dernières années, ou plutôt sa bonne l'année auparavant. Nous avons un management et un board qui est slack. As a result, et qu'un mon un ministère des Finances qui est aussi slack. À cause ce qui est arrivé, c'est qu'ils ont dettes accumulées, and nobody pulled the plug. Et nous voyons, nous les corps aujourd'hui, puis débattre les conséquences. As the parent ministry qu'ils ont été, nous tous nous sommes contents de croire qu'Air Seychelles y en a une viabilité. Mais nous voyons que le ministère des Finances y en a une grande réserve, la viabilité Air Seychelles. Et mon parle les pitch contre le ministère des Finances, les autres voient l'idée d'une certaine façon, le ministère des Finances peut regarder l'idée d'une autre façon. Mais si, disons, des décisions qu'ils prennent par les autres ministres et par le cabinet, qui, pour donner sens à ces choses, pour continuer, le sont regional routes. Qu'est-ce que ça qui fait les autres croire qui autres pour plus bien faire as the parent ministry, qui est un ministère auparavant, pour contrôler board, either par bon du monde qui a appointé le board, ou bien par responsabilité que bon board members y prend, pour faire ci qui, dans 9e l'Assemblée, nous pas still débattre l'eau pour faire aimer ou bien pas pour faire aimer ces choses. Merci, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Chair.
Madame Isaac, please.
Merci, honorable, pour ça. Pareil, tout ça, c'est vrai qu'on est, il y a une nouvelle administration, un nouveau ministre. Mon cas dit, pour dire, nous, team, il y a un team assez nouveau. Le côté nous, département, le côté police stratégie qui nous fait, nous assez nouveau et nous avons besoin capables qui nous peut travailler avec. Et nous pouvons développer, et puis dit auparavant, certaines politiques qui pas développées dans le passé, pour nous capables de mettre en place un structure lui-même, qui est aviation, il gagne zéro. Nous, département, pas dire avec aviation, nous dealons aussi avec port et la marine. Oui, nous sommes petit, mais seulement, par exemple, nous avons un nouveau ministre qui nous peut regarder. Nous connaissons pas qu'à faire recrutement, nous pas capable d'employer du monde pour le moment. Mais seulement nous pouvons développer sa bonne zone qui nous en interne pour être capable de take on the challenge à cause nous portfolio est assez grand. Nous ministère il avec 9 agencies et SHLC en là-dedans. Il y a un qui petit, mais c'est mais il y a un qui a beaucoup plus gros problèmes. Oui, pour le moment, quelquefois, il y a un board qui est un peu non existant, mais seulement il y a un travail qui nous peut faire le côté ministère pour nous reconstituer un board, hopefully, quelquefois, soon, nous bien by latest en masse, qui nous a mis ça board en place. Et le temps nous prenons un board qui nous permet ces choses, c'est pas pour un board qui nous peut choisir du monde au cas du left, right and center. Nous avons des boards qui ont annoncé hier, ça y est, board Ports Authority et board SCA. Je peux voir nos boards, ça des boards qui nous constituent vraiment différents. Son component du monde à cause nous fait l'exercice qui nous vête du monde, besoin de l'expérience, besoin de l'autre connaissances qu'ils ont. Et c'est ça l'approche qui nous prend pour nous constituer un board pour ces choses. Nous pas pour se mettre du monde un board qui nous peut connaître mais il pas pour performer à cause il prend un gros task loli qui pour assurer que ça la compagnie est viable et training et sa component. L'aviation n'est pas quelque chose qui nous connaissons, il y a quelque chose qui est vraiment technique. Nous qui comprenons l'aviation, nous vraiment censés pour nous dire, nous dans ça, nous disons. Mon pas expert, mais c'est mon développement de l'aviation et mon comprend certains components. Et l'autre côté est aussi par pièces, nous des gens qui comprennent l'aviation le côté commercial et le côté sont régulatoire, l'aspect régulatoire aussi. Et ça bord qui peut venir, obviously, nous pour taper into nos bonnes international agencies qui nous disent avec IATA, ICAO pour nous regarder qui est sa bonne board members, ils gagnent sa capacity building, l'aviation pour comprendre quoi ça est airline et quoi ça sa commercialité qui est airline, c'est supposé qu'il fonctionne. Ça qui nous côté ministère nous essayer à mener et nous ministère nous tente pour nous fonctionner un petit peu différemment à cause de ça component qui nous tout en peut imaginer le côté commercialité quoi qui nous capable mener on va revenir pour pays mais non pas juste là pour nous dit dépense taxpayers money pas gain payer à cause nous gain payer pas taxpayers money mais nous bonne l'approche qui nous capable faire nous bonnes entités qui nous travaillent avec vin commercial et je pouvoir pour ça on est bonne quantité projet qui nous en in regards to the commercial aspect of tout nos bonnes entités qui tombent dans nos ministères.
If I may add to what Magali said, that is actually fundamental. So for all of those boards with complex business models or in an industry that requires a bit of experience, so Maggie and I are both ex-SHLs. It makes a difference. On the board of SCA, we have 3 ex-SHL staff, which will surely make a difference. And that training component of the board, we think, is going to be very critical, not just for the board members, but perhaps also for members of government and finance, as well as in the PMC and those who have oversight this way. Because if I may just give some background of myself working with Etihad. So when we had the partnership with Etihad, it was a 40% shareholding, so we had 4 Seychelles board members and 3 Etihad. So it looks like Seychelles obviously has the majority and our chairman is the Seychelles. But what actually happens in a board meeting is you may have 2 or 3 hours with 100 slides, and then you'll have a lot of experts in the room going through the slides. And it's going by very fast. And there's a lot of trust there because, well, it looks like a lot of work, I'm sure. Yeah, okay, it works. I vote because it's very imbalanced. And what needs to happen is that the people on the Seychelles side, of course, we're not going to have that now. Seychelles is going to be 100% owned. But the point is the same. The members of the board have to be conversant with that industry, conversant with what is and is not a reasonable model. not just do things for the government. And so those are the kind of things that we will definitely learn from this exercise, and it's absolutely it. So if we have an SOE, and if it is critical to our economy, obviously it means that we have to raise our game in terms of government and its oversight and how technically competent we are in being able to evaluate this. So what happened in the past will not happen in the future, which is not to say that there was anything wrong with the previous board. It was just structurally, it was a very difficult situation that they had.
Merci. Honorable Lozé.
Merci, Monsieur Speaker. Monsieur Speaker, mon avis des petits éclaircissements, je crois que gagné. Premièrement, from the parent ministry, il paraît que Air Seychelles ont un plan qu'ils ont pu shop around avec. Moi, je suis content qu'on ait. Si autres de parent ministry ont fini à approuver ce plan, qui Air Seychelles PC Bank son future là. Deuxièmement, Monsieur Speaker, moi, je suis envie de demander avec PS Renault, côté qui source sur data à cause, mon pas connaît, comment reconnaître ça software as a, is it a native hard license software ça qui peut servir? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Sorry, have you finished? You want to answer that first? I don't get.
Oui.
Yeah, sorry, Honorable, just
One
on your last
second,
point.
please. Honorable Lozé, on finit.
Okay.
Pose vos questions.
Oui, Mr. Speaker, mon defer.
Thank you. Okay. Oui, Monsieur Renaud.
Thanks, Honorable. No, the data came from ICAO and IATA. I can certainly resend the slides with all the references that it comes from. It's all published online. It's available for member states, and I'll be happy. So everything you saw is legit. I'm only using my Apple Keynote and the software on there. Everything is free of charge on the Apple, unless, you can buy the Apple MacBook. That's the other thing I get paid. But other than that, no, anyone can do it.
Oui, Monsieur Renaud. Oui, Madame Essa, vous pouvez adresser ça?
Par exemple, faire ressortir le côté ça plan qui est Seychelles, par exemple, dit shop around avec. Par exemple, mon comprend Seychelles si right now il y a une bonne émotion qui peut arriver, comment extra faire Seychelles. Moi aussi il y a une émotion qui ou on a ça l'émotion qui ou pas envie voir ça l'accompagner qui on travaille avec peut passer certaines difficultés. Mais le côté ministère, par exemple, ministre fait sortir sur son interview, le SBC, une décision qui nous peut prendre, pas pour baisser l'émotion, il pour baisser la performance. Et ça plan, par exemple, faire ressortir bonnet, nous pas pour dire approuver, mais c'est même pas qu'on discuter et agréer internellement. Et il y a un comité technique qui a mis anything qu'il y a pour faire avec un projet commercial et viabilité. Et mon cas dit pour dire le côté ministère, non, nous pouvons assis ensemble avec Seychelles pour nous comprendre sa plan en détail et en toute son totalité.
Merci. Honorable Lozé, vous avez suivre?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, this is a follow-up. Moi, j'ai envie de demander the parent ministry again. Est-ce qu'il y en a aucune willingness entre autres avec Ministry of Finance pour assis ensemble, trouver common ground et donne-nous un sustainable plan pour le futur Air Seychelles? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci, honorable. Monsieur Renaud.
Thank you, Honorable Member, for that question. If we go to the slide where I drew the circle about the fertile hunting grounds for Seychelles, it represents 26.4% of our traditional market in 2019. I want you to also look very carefully at that slide to make another observation about it. And that is, if you look at that circle, you'll see that it covers a lot of ocean. And in that ocean, there's very little destinations. So the amount of destinations that are actually able to be used is actually quite few. So this is, yeah, if you look at where the circle is, you see that to the south, there's a lot of open ocean where there's very little. opportunity because you're only looking at the top half. Consider if you were, in Europe, elsewhere, there's lots of destinations. So in terms of a sustainable plan, what will have to happen is that Air Seychelles will have to look at all the different destinations, things like Delhi, things like Mumbai, things like Chennai, see if there's an opportunity. Shirin is confident that there's pent-up demand in those tourism markets to bring to Seychelles. Are there destinations in the Middle East, not Dubai, or maybe Dubai or Abu Dhabi that they can develop? So as Magali said, we will be consulting with experts. We're using our own native knowledge where possible. But yeah, what we're working with them is to develop a sustainable plan. And they did have one that involved a lot of transfer traffic, but we have to look over the next 4 years because as we said, in the optimistic case, we'll see 207,000 tourists in 2021. We don't know if we'll have 95,000. In other words, will 2021 be worse than 2020? So I gave that big range, which means that the burden that Air Seychelles will have on us is still unknowable. We still don't know what's going to happen. So this is where, when we ask about a sustainable plan for Air Seychelles, you have to balance that over, we just don't know whether the tourism will pick up because of things we're not foreseeing with countries' policies and with COVID-19 and mutations and like what happens if the vaccination is only good for 6 months? What if there's a new mutation that it doesn't work? What impact will that have, right? So those are the kind of things we just don't know. So yeah, but for sure, we'll be working very closely with finance and with the team at Air Seychelles, who we know are very good, and others to make sure that this will work.
Thank you. À ce point, on n'a pas encore intervenant. Alors, on a terminé pour aujourd'hui. Je suis content de remercier le panel, M. Renaud et Mme Isaac, pour votre présence et votre participation. Moi, dis autres, merci beaucoup et moi, invite les autres pour faire votre départ. Merci. Honorable Georges, vous envoie guidement demain matin. Qui manière vous pouvez imaginer procéder? Continuer avec le comité ou bien aller dans l'Assemblée?
Mr. Chair, non, nous avons sorti dans le comité pour ça, on retourne dans l'Assemblée pour nous continuer nos débats.
Okay.
Nous ne pouvons pas aucun panel, nous ne pouvons pas inviter personne.
Très bien. Alors,
Merci.
on retourne dans l'Assemblée.
Merci.
Mais seulement, avec ça, on va adjourner pour demain matin, 9h. Merci.
All rise.